Apex Express, Asian Pacific Expression.
Community and cultural coverage,
Music and calendar,
new visions and voices.
coming to you with an Asian Pacific Islander point of view.
It's time to get on board the Apex Express.
All across the United States, ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, is terrorizing immigrant neighborhoods. Every time I scroll on social media, I see horrifying videos of children being ripped apart from their parents as they get shoved inside unmarked cars of ICE agents. You can hear the families' cries for help, children wailing, neighbors and protesters yelling at the abductors. The scene is pure chaos, swirling with desperation and fear. I notice I'm clenching my jaw as I imagine the trauma of the moment that will last a lifetime for these families. But the scene usually ends here, and not long after I scroll away, I'm met with another slew of videos of similar intensity. But what happens to the people after this painful moment? What happens to the families after the protesters depart? What happens when their loved ones actually get detained, get deported? Where do they go, and what happens to those who remain? I'm your host, Michelle MiJung Kim, and I'm partnering with the Asian Prisoners Support Committee and Apex Express to bring you stories from families who are grappling with the impossible choices amid the cruelty and horrors of mass detention and deportation. Stories full of truth, understanding, and lived experiences that are too often hidden or silenced.
Even though I don't have no family and I don't even have no family over there, and I don't even know nothing about Vietnam because I left the country when I was 10 years old. My dad raised all four, me and my sibling all by himself. So just emotion and everything washed in. It's just like, heartbreaking. So every time when my dad come to visit me, he always break down and cry because he just like feels sad that his oldest son is going to get shipped back to his country.
My son bought a car for me. He bought a car. He's like, Mama, you're not getting deported. I got you a Honda Civic already. I got you a car. I got a place for you. You know how that affects me when your family member bought you stuff is thinking that you're coming home?
Every family threatened by ICE is different, with their unique traditions, memories, and inside jokes. But there are also fears and questions that every community being ripped apart shares, whether our families are Asian, Latino, Black, or Arab. For many Southeast Asians in the United States, there's one other thing in common. Their families found refuge here in the 70s and 80s, fleeing unthinkable genocide and war in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Most have loved ones who didn't survive. The ones who made it out, around 1.1 million, are the largest refugee community ever resettled in the United States. Upon arriving here, families were forced into impoverished and under-resourced neighborhoods. Parents who just lived through war and genocide never got the mental and physical health care they critically needed. To survive poverty and attacks in their neighborhoods and schools, some youth turned to gangs and crimes. After serving their time, they've since grown up, transformed, and found their ways to heal. They are now mentors, parents, small business owners, homeowners, just everyday neighbors who, like most of us, take their kids to school and pick up groceries and call this country home. And yet, around 16,000 of these Southeast Asian community members are facing imminent deportation based on convictions from years, if not decades ago, and despite the fact that they already served their sentence. Today, California is home to the largest Southeast Asian American population, followed by Texas, Washington, and Minnesota. And these families are seeking answers. How did we get here? What can we do to keep our family safe and together? And their friends and neighbors are asking questions too. How can this be? What can we do? That's where these stories come in. We're taking a closer look at what happens to families after the headlines pass and the blaring noise quiets down. You'll hear directly from people who are living on all sides of this nightmare, all trying to do what's best for their kids, their parents, their loved ones. Welcome to my family. Some listeners may know the Asian Prisoner Support Committee based in Oakland, California was born out of the campaign to support the San Quentin Three, Eddie Zhang, Viet Mike Go, and Rico Riamedio. The San Quentin Three advocated for ethnic studies in the California State Prison, and in retaliation, the prison administration sent them to solitary confinement. Out of that struggle, they started the Restoring Our Original True Selves, or ROOTS program at San Quentin, which the Asian Prisoner Support Committee continues today, teaching hundreds of people under the motto, No History, No Self. No history, no self. Together in ROOTS, community members incarcerated in California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation Prisons, or CDCR, learn immigrant and refugee histories, address intergenerational and inherited trauma, and build lifelong leadership and community skills. Many ROOTS alumni are now mentors and counselors in California, while others are working in reentry, violence prevention, faith, and other community organizations across the state. To kick off our first episode, we'll start with some context from Roger Viet Chung. Roger is faculty in the Department of Ethnic Studies at Laney College in Oakland and founder and faculty lead of Restoring Our Communities, Laney's program for formerly incarcerated students and justice-involved youth. He has served as a lead instructor and curriculum developer of the ROOTS in San Quentin. A content warning for our listeners that in today's episode, we'll be discussing war and genocide, inherited trauma and self-hatred, depression, and family separation. Here's Roger.
My name is Roger Viet Chung. I'm from Oakland, California, and I currently work for Laney College. At Laney College, I instruct in the Department of Ethnic Studies, a range of classes that range from Southeast Asian Studies all the way to courses like race, gender, and sports. In 2013, I had the honor and privilege of supporting and facilitating a course for Asian Americans and others in San Quentin State Prison, and which launched me on a journey of understanding more about incarceration, the prison industrial complex, abolition, the way pipelines form. And since 2013, I've been deeply involved in figuring out how to work reentry, how to support those in custody, how to help people come home, how to help people on parole tell their stories. And so since 2013, I've been working for a program called Restoring Our Communities, which is a reentry program at Laney College where we support the reentry of folks coming home from prison, jail, juvenile hall, and help them explore their post-secondary pathways and dreams. In addition to that, I also run our Laney College, a satellite campus inside the Alameda County Juvenile Justice Center, where we work with young people who are interested in going to college, transferring to four-year universities, and reuniting with their families. I'm a Vietnamese American. I was born in 1978 and born in the United States. My proximity to incarceration and the entire carceral landscape, was pretty distant up until I went to graduate school. When I was in graduate school in the early 2000s, I heard a story about a person named Eddie Zhang, who at that time was incarcerated in San Quentin State Prison. We heard this story about how Eddie and two other folks were asking for ethnic studies programming at their prison when there was a growing movement for education inside CDCR. We understood that, that movement, landed Eddie in solitary confinement, got him transferred to another prison. And I think for me, that was my first moment where, as an Asian American, I connected both with this idea that Asian Americans were doing time, but also, it intersected with my field of study, ethnic studies. And so that was probably my first moment where I saw myself possibly in the work.
Before we come back to Roger, we had a chance to talk to Eddie Zhang about his fight for ethnic studies at San Quentin, the early days of APSC, and how he continues to support incarcerated and formerly incarcerated community members. Let's hear from Eddie.
Bring your breath, everyone. My name is Eddie Zhang. The importance of ethnic studies, Asian American study, is really focuses on the long tradition of the struggles that many of the immigrants and refugees, the people who came to this country for multiple reasons, right? Some of them came voluntarily and some of them came as refugee because of forced migration as a result of the United States foreign policies and then many of the push and pull challenges that came from other countries across the world. The long tradition of that struggle really is an internal one, right? The internal struggle is finding a sense of belonging in a foreign country or in a country, even though we may be born here sometimes, there's still this sense of being treated and being respected as an American versus a perpetual foreigner. And for many of the people who were impacted by the criminal legal system and by this type of oppressive foreign policy and systemic racism, oftentimes people don't necessarily get an opportunity to understand their culture and history that informs their identity. So therefore, as even I was learning how to read and write and speak English and to eventually to become thinking critically, I had experienced the power of when I was able to comprehend and articulate the connection that I have, right, with my ancestors and my culture and the history that informs my identity. Immediately, I was able to find confidence and find that sense of belonging that I was not alone, that there was a long lineage of the knowledge, the connected point to not only who I am as an individual, but then who I am connected to the rest of the humanity, right? I think when we talk about that lineage, it really ties back to the 1968 Third World Liberation Fund, when students and people in the community, the activists that who stood up fighting for the opportunity to have curriculums and or materials that really teaches a more well-rounded history around the makeup of the United States of America. So the fight for the Asian American studies, women's studies, and global studies was very important as it continued to 1969 in UC Berkeley, and then also later on in 1999, where students are also facing threats of having ethnic studies and Asian American studies eliminated from the university curriculum. Right, so I had experienced all of those lineage of struggles to fight for what the basic academic rights for people to learn about each other's culture and history, and how that historically has been continued to diminish and then also trying to erase history. When I was in San Quentin State Prison, then once I was able to start to become a thinker, then I realized, especially after September 11, the scapegoating of people of color, scapegoating of people who came from other countries is perpetuated within the prison industry complex. Myself and three of my friends, we were advocating for the opportunity to be able to engage in this process of asking to have Asian American studies or ethnic studies within the prison college program. And so that was when we signed a proposal, advocating not only for the opportunity to study Asian American histories and cultures, but other people's culture and histories at the same time, and then also honoring the prisoners' rights, right, to choose what we want to learn and how we participate in the decision-making process within the volunteer-run college program in the San Quentin State Prison. The outcome was, the three of my friends who signed the proposal, MiJung, Rico Remedio, we were put into solitary confinement for signing that proposal. And then my other friend who signed the proposal, Stephen Lee, even though he didn't go to solitary confinement, that he was punished as a result of signing the proposal. That's when the forming of an unexpected Asian American movement, right, in the Bay Area, which is the Asian Prisoner Support Committee, where volunteers and activists who have heard of the struggles of the activism inside San Quentin in advocacy for Asian American studies, ethnic studies, and prisoners' rights, that they came together to support us, inside the prison system. And so it's very interesting in that dynamic between we want you to learn and we want to give you opportunity to learn, but then learning and applying what you learn comes at a price. That's where the importance of why ethnic studies of Asian Americans are important, because it allows us to gain power, right? When we gain power of thinking, critical thinking, then there's this fear from the people who have power and don't want to share that power. And so that's why it's very important. So fast forward to post-incarceration first of all, I spent 11 months in solitary confinement as a result of the advocacy in San Quentin. And then later on, when I was finally released after being incarcerated for 21 years, I've never forgotten the importance of creating more learning opportunities within the prison system for those who were still incarcerated. Around 2012, that's when we meaning that, that's when me and members of the Asian Prison Support Committee, we started thinking about how do we go inside the prison and create Asian American Studies and ethnic studies program inside. We were able to, went under, as volunteers, we were able to go into San Quentin State Prison to participate in this program called TRUST. I believe the acronym is Teaching Responsibility Utilizing Sociological Training, which is designed to transform incarcerated men from social liabilities into assets, right? So while we were participating, we were able to get an opportunity to engage the participants who were APIs to ask them if they are interested into creating a program where we're able to learn about our culture and history. And they all agree that it's important. After about almost a year or more of kind of a collaboration, brainstorming, and advocacy from within the prison, finally in 2013, I think that's when we started the first cohort of the Roots program. The Roots acronym is Restoring Our Original True Selves, which is really came about as a result of the brainstorming of the prisoners, many of the life-term prisoners who were inside, because they felt that along the way, they had lost themselves, right, as they were trying to find a sense of belonging. So the goal is to use that as a way to heal intergenerational trauma that many of the prisoners experienced when they came to the United States and that ended up making poor choices and then involved in the criminal legal system. That's when the first Roots program was started in 2013. And then what's interesting was that when it started, I wasn't allowed to go in to participate in the program that I co-founded with the people inside. It wasn't until the graduation of the first cohort of Roots that they allowed me to go in to do a keynote speech, right? Because the participants inside advocated saying that, hey, we would like Eddie to come in to be our keynote speaker at our graduation. And so that's when I was able to go in and really experience this fruition of all the advocacy and seeing many of those leaders and participants graduating from the first year of the Roots program really solidified why the Asian American study is so important, right? It really focuses on for the participant to learn about the connection to their ancestors and their culture and their history. I mean, that sense of belonging they had lost along the way, or for many, was not able to learn in a traditional economic environment. And then part of this is also, even though the curriculum focuses Asian American studies, but then it also connects to other people's colors and histories, and how the intersection of that experience domestically and internationally are connected to the same systems of oppression in that space. I think what is also important is that once they were able to learn about their own culture and history, they inform their identity, they're able to also learn about other people's history, other people's culture that inform their identities. So immediately there's opportunity to humanize each other. And so that's why this is so important, that we must engage in the collective learning process that allow us the opportunity for collective healing. And when the collective learning, collective healing is invested and engaged in racial solidarity, that's how we can embark on this journey of collective liberation. The Roots program is the first ever Asian American studies and studies program in the history of the penal system. And then it continues on to today, right, since 2013.
That was Eddie Zhang. In 2017, Eddie founded the New Breath Foundation to help underserved frontline groups empower, heal, and change the lives of Asian, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander community members, with a focus on the incarcerated, formerly incarcerated, and those who have been impacted by immigration and criminal legal systems. Let's return to Roger and what stood out to him when he first started working in San Quentin.
I think when I first went into San Quentin State Prison in 2013, again, I mentioned I was born in 1978, and I looked across the room to people who were around my age, none of whom were actually born in the United States. And so I think there's this really interesting question that needs to be pursued around Southeast Asians, Asian Americans that have immigrated at a young age, largely through the pathways of war that make that experience so much different than an experience like my own, right? Born here in the United States, but also different than my parents who immigrated to the United States as adults. And so the 1.5 generation, as we will frame it today, we're going to be talking about Asian Americans, Southeast Asians, refugees, immigrants that came to the United States at a young age, all the way up until their adolescence. We're looking at a population that has had significant experience with social institutions like schools, elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools that their parents may not have. This was a time in California where we began to see more prisons being built, more apparatuses designed to be able to figure out how to work with young people, mainly through the lens of punishment and deterrence. And so I think the idea of coming into a state like California during a political landscape where punishment, prisons, and tough on crime positions were being applied to both adults and young people is something to consider when we're thinking about the 1.5 generation that has been incarcerated. I think that as the 1.5 generation immigrated into the United States, through various refugee and immigration policies, they're inheriting a context in California where they've already been criminalized, and their pathways into juvenile halls, into county jails, and into state prisons are being mapped out without them really even knowing. In Roots, which was an Asian Prisoner Support Committee sponsored program, everyone has a unique and individual story. But, the more we learned about people's stories, there just seemed to be a lot of collective threads that tied everyone together. So if we were to talk about the 1.5 generation, like a common collective journey would be something like this, right? Whether a person escaped from Vietnam, Cambodia, or Laos, a lot of the common stories were young people were born in Southeast Asia during or at the tail end of the wars in Southeast Asia, and most of them were not part of the original refugee exodus, which mainly featured the elite and the educated. And so one of the collective stories has been that a lot of the 1.5 generation who would have otherwise left at much younger ages or even been born in the United States were experiencing significant transitions in countries that were returning from civil war. A lot of that destruction and a lot of the trauma and those experiences, right, began right around there. And when people began thinking about exiting these positions, whether it be for political or class-based reasons or both, one of the collective stories that we tended to hear very often was that young people were really able to visualize, remember, right, even today, a lot of violence, a lot of trauma that really propelled either their escape or their emigration. Young people went to camps. Oftentimes, if they left Vietnam, they were in the Philippines, Malaysia, Hong Kong, or Thailand. And if you left Cambodia or you left Laos, you ended up in a variety of different forms of camps in Thailand, awaiting for United Nations sponsorship. I think this is an important part of understanding the journey because a lot of the 1.5 generation that became incarcerated were exposed to a variety of different traumas at young ages that they still had kind of these vivid memories of. And so as they left camps, many stayed in camps for months, some even years. They were resettled into the United States, often in places that didn't have a lot of Asian Americans. And so at the time, United States refugee policy really asked all the states to share, right, some sort of, right, burden in resettling refugees. And so a lot of the 1.5 generation that we met inside San Quentin, their story in the United States didn't actually originate in California. Many of them were in Wisconsin or Ohio or Florida or Arkansas as their first stop into the United States before their parents did a secondary migration into a place that had more support, had a stronger ethnic community, and in some cases, right, just had more protection against racial discrimination. And so as parents moved into ethnic communities and sought spaces that could protect themselves from racial discrimination, the young students, right, the 1.5 generation, didn't have those same protections. And so many of them were enrolled into public schools, oftentimes schools that were underfunded, and oftentimes schools that were in districts that had young people of color competing for resources. When it came to that 1.5 generation, that journey into United States schools was, I think, the beginning of understanding how to survive in a place where a unique form of racial discrimination, a unique form, right, of class identity had to be navigated. As they began their journeys in education, a lot of them feeling a lot of pressure to be strong students in order to, deliver their parents out of poverty. A lot of themes came up. One of the approaches that we took in the Roots program was looking at trauma. We're not the first program to look at this, but I do think that it's a very important and interesting way to think about understanding the stories of people who are incarcerated. Oftentimes the narrative of people who are incarcerated is that they have committed an act that has traumatized another person. And therefore, right, their own trauma is something that we often either don't allow, ignore, or outright say, right, you don't deserve your own trauma because of the things that landed you in custody. And so I think one of the projects that we really wanted to look at was to help people kind of like name their trauma, explore it, and right, heal from it. And so when we thought about the activities and the curriculum design, we had people kind of share stories of immigration, share stories of how their parents came to name them, stuff like that. And, one humongous theme that came out in the Roots program was this idea of self-hatred and how much being in, right, the United States and being in places where you experience discrimination and you experience poverty led to really, really low concepts of self and really resulted in people literally writing, right, reflections, saying things like, I hated myself. I hated how I looked, right? I hated my name. Those are some of the themes that kind of were fleshed out as we explored the Roots program. And we wanted to take a look at how that trauma not only would help people kind of understand their own trajectories more, but how that trauma could also be translated into, right, a more institutional form of advocacy for themselves and understanding how to do things like describe and explain, right, and be introspective about the things in their youth that led to, right, their incarceration. Because one of the things we also noticed was that people were struggling to tell stories about their families because they didn't want to bring shame, they didn't want to blame their families. And so a lot of our 1.5 generation folks struggled with being able to tell a story to a parole board that kind of held their freedom in their hands. And so being able to have people tell their stories, right, to engage, right, some of the things that they experienced as traumatic, help them heal from those things, but also name them through ethnic studies concepts, through history, and through culture was in a lot of ways very freeing. I think I'd be remiss to not mention that, when we did programming inside Roots, there was a very, very, I think, collective, agreed upon workshop that people inside wanted to do. And it was a workshop about gangs, not just the criminalization of gangs and how gangs had become criminalized into the 90s, into the 2000s, but I think incarcerated people were really advocating around things like gang prevention. And so a lot of stories came out around like why people join gangs in the first place. And it's not a brand new story at all, but it was something that they wanted to explore. And they were really, I think, very adamant about exploring among themselves. And, I think if you talk to incarcerated people, one of the things that they're so passionate about is making sure their stories reach young people, which has also inspired me to go into juvenile hall to do a lot of work. But one of the things that they wanted to develop, I think conceptually, was the idea of the migration to school to gang pipeline. And, whether or not the gang itself should be conceptualized as, right, a protective mechanism against racism, against bullying, against harassment, against exploitation. I mean, those are all things that we know young people are looking for as they join gangs, especially those that are immigrating from Southeast Asia or even, right, Latin America. I think the folks inside were really, really adamant about making that connection and understanding that not only their participation in gangs, but the criminalization of the gangs through that participation was one of the pathways that led them to places like Juvenile Hall, the California Youth Authority, the Division of Juvenile Justice. I think the folks inside would say that they need to be accountable to, the decisions that they made, and they wish that they were stronger about not making decisions to do things like join criminal-based organizations. But I think that there is a reality that, there are a lot of social forces that drove that type of youth behavior. And so when we were in San Quentin, I think a lot of the folks were like, we need to improve this idea by, understanding that part of our journey has been as 1.5 generation young people is our responses to our trauma, our responses to racism, our responses to disconnects between us and our families, particularly our parents, right, led us through a path that was laden with policies that were designed to punish us. I think something that's really important that I would want to mention is, the apparatuses that were designed to control and to rehabilitate and to correct youth, those apparatuses have been abolished because they didn't work. And so when I think about the 1.5 generation that immigrated to the United States during a time of heavy, heavy juvenile punishment, had they immigrated today, right, and these systems not existing, would they have done a significant time in state prison? I don't know. Would they have been criminally adjudicated as adults? I don't know. And so I think that when we think about, Asian Americans and Southeast Asians and Pacific Islanders that are coming to the United States at a very specific time, specifically those guys we worked with in Roots, history was just not on their side, and that's not something that individuals can control. And so when we think about the situations that were put in, I reflect on my own life about, looking at people that look like me that were the same age as me and just weren't born in the United States and had privileges like I did. I think those are some of the things that I would ask the community to reflect upon, that, we're looking at such a traumatic and punished time in California and US history, to really kind of take a broader approach and to be able to, deconstruct some of the things that have happened to help understand the lives of people who, are in ICE detention today.
That was Roger Viet Chung, faculty in Laney College's Department of Ethnic Studies and founder of Restoring Our Communities. This is Apex Express. We'll return after a short break.
We were refugees. It was because of the war, the secret war in Laos, I guess.
This is NC. He grew up in California after his parents' harrowing escape from war and persecution in Laos. He was incarcerated for 24 years as a result of a conviction when he was a young person. He earned parole last year, in 2025.
I don't know for sure, but I'm just going off what people say and what they tell me is because we were refugees and we were hunted. And so we fled and crossed the river into Thailand. And from Thailand, we were sent to the US. That's it. When I came here, my dad says, well, you got to learn everything here, know the language and everything, because this is your country now. You can live here. So that's what he told me. Things were tough because my parents don't know nothing about this country. So they don't, help was very, I would say, I think the best word can use is help was very narrow because I had like an uncle who knew the language and they would help my dad and my mom. And then my dad actually went to a vocational training school to learn how to do auto body. This was when we were in Long Beach, but they came over to Stockton to open up a garage to fix cars and do auto body. Growing up, it was just hard because, we were always poor and we didn't know how to adjust to the community. In America is like totally different because we go to school and then we read, write, speak English, and then we don't do none of that inside the house. So there's kind of that culture clash where the parents want to teach you something and then you go to school and you learn something else, and then you struggle with your everyday life because those are two different things. I was basically working while I was in prison, taking a lot of self-help classes and earning certifications and trying to better myself, learning job skills. So when I parole, I can become a productive member of society. So while I was also incarcerated, I was taking college courses to try to attain a AA degree. So I was doing a lot of that stuff while I was in prison, programming. My plan was when I got out, as far as for work, I would just like any job would do. As long as I got work, any job would do. But the goal was to continue my education, get my degree in sociology, try to open up a place and to be LCSW certified, a licensed clinical social worker. So I can help people just like how when I was incarcerated, I was talking to an LCSW so they can like help you when you get back from this environment to the streets to help you adjust. First of all, is helping people. And a lot of people, when you come out and get out, there's really nothing like nobody's the way I see it is like I don't see a lot of help. I don't see a lot of help or any help in my community that I'm at. I figured that what, more help or help is always good. And a lot of times people while I was incarcerated, incarceration does affect you. It in a way institutionalizes you. It makes you think a certain way, act a certain way, be a certain way. And when you come out, you have to like try to adjust to, the norms of outside living. When I was talking to my social worker, she was giving me a lot of those pointers. So I was thinking like, okay, what, this is something I could do. I could help, youth who's been incarcerated or young people coming out or anybody of any ages from anywhere that has cultural issues. Like if they're coming from a different country and they're coming to the US and they're having like cultural issues. It's just about transitioning from one place to another place. And when I paroled from prison, and they told me that I have a ICE hold, an immigration hold. And then I wasn't sure like what that was, if it's happening or not. And then when they paroled me, immigration came and picked me up and took me to a detention facility. ICE came and picked me up at the prison. And I went to a detention facility in Bakersfield called Mesa Verde.
We're going to come back to NC and what he experienced at Mesa Verde on the next episode, and what happened after he was deported to Laos just 4 months ago. Right now, I want to introduce you to another community member, Pam. Pam also grew up in California. She was incarcerated for 16 years. 3 years ago, she was detained by ICE and then deported to Cambodia.
So I'm gonna start it off when the day I find out that I'm supposed to get deported in 2012. ICE came and see me and they said, well, we got you on record that, you're on the list that you're gonna get deported when you parole. So if I have any kind like American citizen to prove that, I can't parole and this and that, I was like, okay. I really didn't pay attention. My mind was more like stuck on that day. My mind was more like, wait, my attorney told me I'm not ever gonna get deported. And it just my mind is like wandering off, like, why is this happening now? So other than that, I started doing research. I just signed the paper. I didn't even hear exactly what they told me because my mind is already like blow. So I just signed the paper, didn't know what I'm signing. So I just signed the paper like so they can leave me alone. I just need to process something on my own. When I finally process, I start doing research. But before I start doing research, I called my parent up and told them what's gonna happen. And my parents told me, just tell them you don't have a family over there. There's nobody over there that could support you, take care of you. You've been here in America all your life. There's nobody. So why did someone to send you over there and says you already did your time? So it's a lot of mixed feeling. It's a lot of mixed feeling as I can see there's a lot of hurt inside my family. I can see what they go through. And then I was like, okay, now it's just too much. So out there, I talk to my parent and see how they feel about it. And I understand and I do feel them too. And I do understand. Because I've never been raised separate from my family that long until I got locked up. So it's a harder difficulty than anything. I don't even move away from my mom that far. I live across the street. So it's hard for me to see that I'm really like can't see my mom ever again. I started doing research for years and years and still hoping that I could fight in while I'm in prison. But people keep on telling me you can't fight your case, how you get to the ICE detainer, and that's how you fight your case. And it's like, I need to find out. I started doing more research on the law library about ICE and, about deportation, everything about the law. I did all that, but it's nothing that really helped me unless it's something against my life. So, and I did more research about like anything they say the only way you could get away from it is like something affects your life, something that danger you is like it's mean life or death. But I even do research on that. They say they stopped the war in Cambodian. So it was hard. It was just a lot. It was just a lot of paperwork that I have to go through and try to do the research and find out. So I started talking to more about with my family about that. And then my dad said, I can see this is really stressing you out. And I can see that you're looking through a lot of stuff that don't help you to get out. But we still have hope that you can come home to us.
Every person who shared their story with us talked about the family members and friends who supported them through these traumatic experiences, those who have stood with them in the darkest of times. Those relationships are what keeps people going, and it's no different for the person you're about to hear from, T. T served his time in prison many years ago. After he got out of prison, he led a full life. He got married, became a father, and grew in his career as a superintendent of a welding business, including jobs for the U.S. Navy. And then, one day, everything changed.
I've been reporting as scheduled to the ICE agent every I start out once a month, once every 3 months, once every 6 months, once every year. And I've been reporting perfectly how they want it. And then one day, I came home and I went check my mail, and there's a mail from them. So I opened the mail up, and it tells me, the bell tells me they're gonna detain me. They give me a date to be there, and they say they're gonna detain me. And my heart just sank. When I saw that letter, I like, oh my God, and it broke me down right there, standing over there by the mailbox, and then I told my wife, and we both sat and do a little crying, and it's just like depressed, knowing that they can detain me, that scheduled date that they gave me. Yeah, it was tough. It's like a little. I think they gave us like a month or something. No, 3 weeks, no, a month, something like that. It was tough because me and my wife and my two daughters, we have family. They okay. Yeah, I checked in and they did detain me, and of course my wife's all crying, and both my daughters young at that time. They were still young. They don't know what happened. They asked my wife, "Hey, where's Dad?" And my wife didn't tell them what happened yet because my wife didn't want them to worry. So my wife just told them, "No, your dad went to work. Maybe he'll be gone maybe a month or so." And she just don't want to feel bad. But yeah, my wife went through some stuff and trying to figure things out while I was in the detention center. And yeah, I got interviewed and got deported. And my wife, she was struggling at that time. She didn't work either because she stayed home as a housewife, take the kids to school and stuff like that.
T's wife and daughter are now with him in Cambodia. He's currently serving as a staff member at New Light Wellness in Phnom Penh, providing mental health and healing services to other people and families who are deported and separated.
Yes, to me, it's very important to have someone to talk to because when you're deported, you already broken. You feel like you're a broken person, and sometimes you don't know who to talk to because you're at a new place. You don't really know no one, and it's heartbreaking. You're trying to find someone to talk to. You feel like you're alone. But at New Light, we provide all that. You need someone to talk to here. You could pick one of our team here to talk to. You can go to the facility that we have over there and just talk to someone and just relax over there and just, we always have someone there to help, to talk about anything you want, to guide, to bring closure. That's the thing about our team here. We want to make sure we have all that, everything, because we understand being deported, need someone to talk to, because that's what I did when the first couple of years when I got deported here, and I was so stressed out. I don't know who to turn to, where to go. Luckily, I found New Light, and I'm so glad. And I'm still with them now. Deportation, to me, I feel it is very cruel. It breaks families apart, and then change the life and future of your children. Deportation, it's just a sad word. It's just a sad word. It's like pain. It's a lot of pain, that word deportation. It's a lot of pain. I mean, it's just, to me, it's just a lot of pain. It's just getting ripped off from your family, and it affect everyone. It affect, your brother and sister, your cousin, your niece, your nephew. That's how I sees it.
Yeah, I think it's, I think it's important to understand that, deportation isn't something that existed since 1776, right?
That familiar voice is Roger, who you heard from earlier. Here's what he thinks about previously incarcerated people getting deported despite having already served their time.
And so I think when we kind of think about the logics of a person who is serving a sentence and is being released by even authorities around in the carceral state and determining that they're not a threat to society, that they're no longer harmful to society, that they've done their rehabilitation in order to continue to contribute to, right, the nation and to their families and their communities. I think we have a very contradictory message where, you actually have a carceral apparatus naming a person as no longer a harm to society, but then, right, being deported. And so when we think about these stories, and I remember talking to a life-term prisoner who has children who are born in the United States. And he's going up to the parole board and he has an ICE hold. He has, a mandatory deportation because of his conviction. He's asking the questions to himself, what do I do? Do I fight to be released from prison? If that's the case, I might get taken to ICE custody right away and get my travel documents prepared to be deported. Or do I stay in prison so that my family can continue to see me in the United States, right? And maybe I don't do the types of things that are going to win me my freedom in front of a parole board. And I think those are the types of contradictions in the stories that I think illuminate the contradictions and, right, like the problems with the way that we approach deportation today. There's the idea of deportation. We often, I think, because it's related to law, oftentimes, right, our communities see that as an objective or neutral phenomenon that's always been that way. And so I think when we try to get folks to kind of understand the ways that deportation and, immigration policy has been shaped, one of the things that I'll ask students, I remember being inside San Quentin, and I ask this of my Laney students all the time, I asked them, when was Immigration and Customs Enforcement founded? What year was like the birth of what we understand now as ICE? And students will guess, they'll guess, and maybe they'll look it up online and they'll say, oh, Roger, it was 2001. Then I'll ask people, who's older, you or ICE? And most of the time, the people that I ask are older than ICE. And so I think one of the ways that we kind of approach this is, by understanding that what's happening now is a very new and contemporary phenomenon, immigration in its most brutal form, right? Or deportation in its most brutal form. And I asked people, right, what was ICE called before it was called ICE? There was an organization that existed before. And people will struggle a little bit. And then, I'll say the initials, INS. And then people will say, what does that stand for? INS stands for Immigration Naturalization Services. And so you have this really significant institutional difference just in the name itself around how a migrant is being treated and perceived. Right? On the one hand, right, you have enforcement through ICE. But for the most part, right, immigration policy in the United States was not ICE. It was naturalization services, right? It was about welcoming people to come to the United States, contribute, be taxpayers, right? And become citizens, become naturalized. And so I think that's one of the ways that we begin thinking about how to deconstruct the idea that deportation is just a matter of law. It's a neutral idea and that it's always existed in the form that it has. And, we know that the law that really is driving Asian American deportation and other immigrant-based deportation today is a law that was designed in 1996. And so the way that we see, right, immigration today is really kind of like a parcel, a very small piece of immigration history and deportation history for that matter in the United States. And I think that's one way that I think helps people understand that, what we're seeing now is a phenomenon that doesn't have to be what it is. I'm lucky enough to be able to be part of a post-secondary system that is, one of the largest in the world and one of the most welcoming in the world. I feel like part of my passion or my drive to keep going is I feel like there are some things that are still very much unexplored around this concept of reentry. When I was in juvenile hall a couple of years ago, I met a young person who told me that he didn't have a good relationship with his dad. His dad wasn't in his life. His dad has been in and out of prison, and learned mostly about his dad through his sister, but began reconnecting with him a little bit. This young person had a pretty significant conviction inside the juvenile hall, which, like I mentioned earlier, which had it happened 10, 15 years ago, he would be in the California Youth Authority. And, he was telling me about his dad, and there were so many things that felt like I knew him. He told me the job that his dad had, which is a very unique job that is not very common. And I wrote who I thought his dad was on a piece of paper, and I showed it to him. And he said, yes, that's my dad. And so his dad came to Laney College, joined the machining program after years in prison, and got, a living wage job in the steel industry, was able to buy a home, and he was able to put his daughter through graduate school. But he never mentioned a son to me. And I left the hall that day and I called him walking to my car and I said, hey, I think I met your son. I didn't know you had one. And he said, yeah, that's still a shameful part of my life that I'm still trying to figure out. And so I think that there's something that we're missing still. I think, when in San Quentin, we talked about intergenerational trauma and the trauma that you can inherit from your parents and your parents' parents. And I think there's something here where, we can engage both generations at once to really kind of figure out some of this healing. I feel like there's still something that we as a team, as a family, and as a community are on the verge of understanding a little bit better and breaking those cycles.
I can't stop thinking about what T said about the word deportation. It's cruel. It's a painful word. It's a sad word that rips you off from your family. Many of our listeners are here because you believe a different world is possible, one that replaces isolation with kinship, trauma with repair, and loss with transformation. You want a future full of families together and safe. That's the kind of future we at my family want too. Each story we share is not only a reminder about the violent systems that harm so many communities, but it's also a reminder of how much each of us is needed in this fight for a more just and liberatory future. There is so much pain and trauma in each person's story. There's also so much strength, resilience, and a steadfast belief in community and hope. I'm taking a deep breath as I reflect on these stories, and I invite you to do the same.
បងនៅតែចាំអូនជានិញមិនអាចបំភ្លេចទេណានួនឡង
And if you're impacted by mass deportation and detention, there are organizations and advocates who can help you, from mental health and wellness to legal help and family support. In Northern California, where we are based, we encourage you to reach out to the Asian Prisoner Support Committee, the Center for Empowering Refugees and Immigrants, and New Light Wellness. You'll find links to these organizations in the show notes at kpfa.org/program/apex-express. The music in today's program is by Cambodian-Australian singer and songwriter Satia. We'll include links to his songs in the show notes too. We hope you'll join us for episodes 2 and 3 of My Family, where we'll deep dive into what happens when our family and neighbors are detained, and what happens when they are forced to move to a country they've never known. Thank you for joining, and we'll see you next time on My Family. I'm your host, Michelle MiJung Kim, and this podcast is brought to you by Apex Express and the Asian Prisoner Support Committee. Apex Express is produced by Ayame Keen Lee, Anuj Vaidya, Isabel Lee, Jelena Keen Lee, Miko Lee, Miyata Tan, Preeti Mangala Shakar, and Swati Rayasam. Have a great night.
Hello, I'm Susan Young, Chair of the Pacifica Foundation Board of Directors. One of the exciting things happening across Pacifica is our national news service. Every weekday, we're bringing together stories and reporting from across our network, giving listeners a broader perspective of what's happening around the country and the world. It's another way Pacifica fulfills its mission of providing independent journalism and thoughtful coverage of the issues that matter most to our communities. We get to hear from longshoremen in Oakland, a nurse in the Bronx, a farm worker in Ruidoso, a screenwriter in LA, and a school teacher in Washington, D.C. We can hear their own lives reflected back with dignity and depth.
Base Command, all systems go. We are go for launch.
This is when KPFA music takes over. Raw, eclectic, real. No playlist algorithms, no corporate formatting. Just sound that moves, shifts, and surprises. Jazz bleeding into cumbia. Folk crashing into noise. The underground rising to the surface. No two nights are ever the same on KPFA. Throttle up. This night has no ceiling. Find your groove at 94.1 FM, kpfa.org.
KPFA broadcast engaged, holding steady.
This is 94.1 KPFA and 89.3 KPFB in Berkeley, 88.1 KFCF in Fresno, everywhere at kpfa.org.